We have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case after all of these weeks. And if you thought that was the only major decision of the day, you would be wrong. We're going to talk about what happened on this absolutely monumental day in court.
Diddy screamed in court. Loud, raw, bone-shaking. A sound you don't fake. A sound that cuts through every protocol, every microphone, every breath in the room. He screamed because in one moment, in one sentence, everything unraveled.
Not guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Cassie, guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Jane, guilty. That was the historic verdict out of the Sean Diddy Combs criminal court today. A split verdict after almost 13 hours of deliberations and weeks of testimony and evidence and arguments. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the more severe charges, the ones that carried the stiffest prison sentence, potentially 15 years to life in prison, but convicted him of the Mann Act charges, which, by the way, carry up to 10 years in prison each, although I will tell you in a filing today from the government, it appears the sentencing range they're looking for is 51 to 63 months, so 4 to 5 years. However, there is no mandatory minimum. So would the judge go lower? We'll talk about what the defense is asking for too. And also, whatever the sentences are, would he combine the sentences consecutively, one after another? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of questions, but I'll tell you what, you would think that the verdict would be just the only big part of today. You would think that's the only major decision. Not the case, because we got to talk about what happened later on in the day, the bail hearing. Right after the verdict, it was a question of should Sean Combs be granted release while awaiting sentencing, which the judge set today, by the way. Sort of set the sentencing date. I'll talk more about that as well. But I mean, let's talk about Sean Combs. He's been locked up since September 2024. He's been denied bail at each turn. There was a change of circumstances here. He had just been acquitted of 3 of the charges. So could he make bail? We're going to talk about it. All right, so to discuss the hearing and more, let me bring on once again, hopefully not for the last time, but we're at basically the end of this case until sentencing. Joined once again by Long Crimes in Court reporter Elizabeth Milner. Great to see you. First of all, your reaction to the verdict. Is this what you expected? Because let's really briefly explain what happened yesterday. That, you know, we thought it kind of gave us a preview into what would happen today. Not necessarily so.
Yeah, I was not going to lie, Jesse, a little surprised by the verdicts in that I really kind of thought there was a really strong case for count 2, that obviously being sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie Ventura. And that was only because of the questions that the jury was asking when they were bringing some notes back. And that was kind of in relation to what had happened at specific instances that the government point out were allegations of sex trafficking. So I thought because of the tone that was inside the courtroom, the way the family was getting a little bit emotional sitting inside the gallery, even Diddy's demeanor, for the most part, we've seen him kind of really keep up his spirits. But yesterday was really a time where we kind of saw, I think, the weight weighing in on him, that it's possible a conviction on some of the more serious charges were going to happen. And so when the jury came back not guilty on count 1, 2, and 4, you know, I was a little surprised, especially to count 2, but, you know, I do respect the jury's decision. They spent a lot of time listening to this case, listening to all the testimony, listening to all the evidence, and that was the verdict that they had rendered.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised that they found him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. We have been saying since for weeks on this show that felt like a straightforward path to conviction. Wasn't surprised not guilty with Jane, given some of the gray areas of her testimony, but also the jury didn't even ask for one readback of her testimony or anything to do with her testimony, so it made me think.
The judge announced years of prison time. Staggering. Severe. And before you could blink, the man who built an empire collapsed under its weight. The courtroom was electric, every seat filled. Reporters hanging off the edges of benches, cameras poised, everyone waiting for the final act. The testimonies had been gruesome, graphic, delivered with conviction. Witnesses rose, time after time, and recounted details so vivid, so horrifying, the judge paused before sentencing. He cited them personally in his remarks. Patterns of abuse, concealed violence, repeated denial, and he made it clear. This sentence will not be lenient. This sentence will serve notice. Then came the moment. The gavel dropped. No hesitation. No mercy. Every count tallied. Every year signed into record. And in that instant, the room went from tense to thunderous. Diddy exploded, full-bodied scream that echoed off old walls.
Don't forget, I was getting calls during this trial from individuals that were telling me, hey, I have information that exonerates what they're saying against Sean Combs, essentially saying that Cassie and others were participating more than just having sex in a room. They were participating more than that. They were paying people. They were hiring people. They were sending me pictures even when Diddy wasn't around. They were asking me to come over even when Diddy wasn't around. These were what these witnesses were telling me, which is really Brady evidence. And I don't know if that was ever turned over. But the more interesting argument is that all these counts were charged. The only thing he was convicted of were the Mann Acts. And he probably wouldn't have been convicted of these Mann Acts but for all this other stuff that came in to try and prove these counts that they could not prove and did not have a basis for bringing.
Let me just challenge you on that, because this is a jury who didn't find that there was sex trafficking. And I can't confirm that they found him guilty of the Mann Act because of the hotel video or anything else. I mean, it seems to me that they might have convicted him on that based on the travel records, the payment receipts, all about that. Not even necessarily allegations of violence. I mean, do you think that it was because of, let's say, the Intercontinental Hotel video that he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution? It always felt to me that they proved that charge based purely on, the documents.
Well, I always feel like during a trial, whenever you get a guilty verdict on one of the counts or two of the counts out of 6 or 7, you think to yourself, is it because of these other things that they brought up? How bad he is, he's not a good guy, the video came out. Sometimes juries will split the baby, meaning, there's people that want to convict, there's people that don't want to convict, and they're like, okay, let's convict him on these acts. We can all agree we can convict him on these acts. He's not a good guy. He transported these men across state lines. Let's convict him on this. There's always going to be a question of that. The only way to not have a question of that, obviously, is when the jury comes out, someone gives an interview and says, hey, this is why we did it, is because, this tape was so bad and these other incidents were so bad that we were like, we can't just let him walk with nothing. So we convicted him on the Mann Acts. Now, we don't have a juror saying that. Do I think eventually jurors are going to start coming out? Yeah, I think so. I think some of these jurors are going to come out. They're going to want to do some interviews, not before sentencing. And I think after sentencing, I think some of them will come out and we'll discuss it, because I think that was the feeling I was getting from this jury and the reactions they had to Comey's closing, and even the reaction just in general to the 5 or the 6 U.S. attorney team. I think their reactions in general were very noticeable, and I think that this is a jury that wants to talk to people once I think he gets sentenced.
Okay, so now let's move on to the pardon discussion. So if he can't get relief from the court in getting the conviction thrown out or a new trial, can he get relief through a pardon? Before we talk about, is this a real thing, what is the process to even obtain a federal pardon? How do you even go about that?
Sure. So it's a pardon or a commutation. If someone is actually in custody, they could also get a commutation, which does not wipe the crime off your record. It just allows you to get out of jail. So he has that option to give him a commutation. If he gets sentenced, he can also give him a commutation. But as for the process, there's an application on the DOJ website, and I'm part of some charities that also do a lot of pro bono work for pardons and commutations. You can fill out this form, DOJ website. It essentially lists the reasons why you should get a pardon, what kind of community service you've done, things of that nature. There's a separate application for a commutation, but you can file a pardon application, and you could also say, hey, listen, if it's not a pardon, I'm looking for a commutation. You attach your indictment, you would reasons why you feel you're...
No, he shouted. One word: massive fury, massive despair, massive finality. Security leapt, lawyers swarmed. The bailiffs froze. But the moment was done. That scream defined it. It shattered the illusion. It announced collapse. The moment a man who once owned stages and suites was forced to own this. Real. Unforgiving. Final. This wasn't performative. This wasn't flair for the cameras. It was breakdown. Real emotional collapse on display. The man who wore power like armor suddenly stripped of it all. Guttural sound. Primal isolation. It was the final reveal, and everyone heard it. People in the gallery gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others drew breath sharp. Even court journalists, trained to stay composed, lost their grip for a second. They watched a live unspooling of fear, remorse, and reality. And there was no spin to soften it. No press release to spin it.
That it just doesn't fit very well here,
I
especially
get
when
it.
you're talking about all these
Yeah.
people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And that was
Yeah.
a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? You know, what's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages, the conduct that arguably contradicts someone being a victim, and I know there's complicated factors between an abuser and a victim, the trauma. I get it. I totally understand it, but I wonder if that's what saddled the jury. Okay, I want to move past the verdict because now we have to talk about what's happening next. First thing, when the sentencing hearing is going to happen. So they have this hearing next week about whether to expedite the sentencing, happening before October 3rd. If both sides agree, great. If they don't, what is a compelling legal argument for the defense to say, we want this sentencing to happen much sooner?
Well, I mean, we know that behind the scenes, what they want, of course, is they expect a chance that he's going to be released. So that's their big motivating factor, of course. Whether the court abides by that, I mean, it is a substantial change in circumstance. He was acquitted of all of these serious charges, right?
But he was
Like
just denied bail. He was denied bail again.
he was denied bail again, and I actually learned that on your segment yesterday afternoon as I was sort of
Yeah.
doing my preparation for this. But we have to remember that one of the things that he got in trouble for, that Diddy got in trouble for in jail, was using other inmates' calling number. Remember that? So he was calling witnesses in the case from jail using other inmates. That was a direct affront to that judge. That was remember, we had all those attempts at bail that were denied at the very beginning of the case, one after another after another. This judge, and it's the same judge who's going to sentence him, denied that over and over again. And you and I, again, in another conversation we had on your show, we both said he is screwed now, that he's got no chance because he's violating the rules of the court while in jail. So if he's disobeying the rules of the jail and the directive of the court while he's in custody, how can he be expected to actually follow the terms of a bail agreement when he's out of custody?
Right.
And I think that chicken is coming home to roost again. I mean, I think that's what happened yesterday afternoon. That any judge who has a criminal defendant who behaves like that, that is an affront to the court itself. It's disrespectful to the
Sure.
court. And it's almost like he couldn't get out of his own way there at the beginning. But he had an excellent defense team.
He does. So assuming for a moment, whenever the sentencing hearing happens, right? Let's say it happens in a month from now. Let's say it has October 3rd. The question is, what's his sentence? As we mentioned, the prosecution in a filing from yesterday talked about the guidelines range being 51 to 63 months. Now, this is before a pre-sentencing investigation and report. Now, the defense, right, they want 21 months. He's already served almost 10. Talk to us about what you're thinking here, because there is no minimum. The maximum's 10. If the judge were to combine it together, like you said, 20 years, feels highly unlikely that would happen. As we're taught, what is a pre-sentencing report investigation? How would it affect this? What do you think the judge is going to do? There's so many different factors to consider here, and it's not like a murder case when it's like, okay, we know what's going to happen. It's like life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a given. There's room here. What do you think the judge is going to do?
So in federal court, this is actually very interesting. They rely very heavily on those pre-sentencing investigations. So essentially what will happen is there'll be a federal probation officer. And
Today, that scream became his statement. The judge didn't flinch, didn't bat an eyelash. He finished reading the sentence. Cold, clinical, precise. Years in prison, longer than any prediction. Maximum terms, no parole mentioned, no suspended time, just reality. And as he pronounced it, Every journalist in that room knew they were witnessing one of the most brutal moments in legal and cultural history. Outside, the scramble was immediate. News feeds lit up. Breaking news banners flashed. Social media exploded. Live streams trended. Fans wept. Critics cheered. The world divided instantly. But inside, only one thing mattered. That scream. That raw fracture. That end. From that point on, Diddy was no longer a public figure. He was an inmate. An unmistakable shift. His lawyers tried to calm him. He waved them off. He collapsed, shouting, "No!" as though for every year they just crushed onto him. Nobody's voice mattered except his, because it was the moment the empire fell. Not quietly, but loudly, with real pain. Witnesses later said the testimonies were the key. Graphic, detailed, unambiguous. Not every trial has that degree of weight behind it, and this one did. Witnesses had described patterns not just of alleged wrongdoing, but of concealment, intimidation, abuse of power. The judge referenced those patterns in his sentencing remarks. He explained this wasn't just a case.
Or that fraud was used, or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no...
It was a systemic failure. The sentencing wasn't just punishment, it was a statement. And Diddy's scream? It was the sound of everything slipping away. Everything built, everything earned, everything paid for. All undone in 15 seconds of emotional collapse in front of the world. His legal team intervened. Court officers hovered. But once that cry filled the room, nothing would contain it. Because it wasn't acting. It was truth. And in a room full of lawyers and cameras and witnesses, truth sounded like that. It was tragic. It was seismic. It was public. And it defined every headline after. Diddy screams in court. Courtroom erupts. Fallen empire. Moments like this don't just make news. They become history. Because the fall was loud. It was real. And everyone saw it. Later, reporters recounted how court security had to physically restrain him. Because after that scream, he was cut loose. He was done. He was irretrievable. A man undone in raw detail. And that's all the story needed. Outside, protesters gathered. Fans prayed. Social media lit up. But inside sandwiched coverage, legal scrutiny, cultural debate in one sonic moment. That scream served notice that nothing would ever be the same. The sentence stood. No retreat. No mercy. And Diddy's scream echoed long after he was removed. It was played, shared, dissected. Because breakdowns don't just happen in private. They happen in courtrooms. They happen in public. And they happen when the system finally catches up. People asked, will he appeal? Maybe. But nothing undoes that moment. Nothing will silence that scream. The legal process might reverse sentences. But the cultural record won't. Because some collapses echo in headlines. Some screams rewrite legacies. This one echoed through time. Diddy screamed in court. And with it came the end, not just of a trial, but of a myth. And everyone heard it.